I have been financially supporting the family all my life, and my parents signed over all the property to my brother, who has been on their backs all my life, so I left them forever. I've been the one holding this family together for as long as I can remember. My parents got sick a few years back, nothing dramatic, just a slow grind of health issues that piled up until they couldn't work anymore. Dad's got diabetes that's gone unchecked for too long, and Mom's knees are shot from years of standing at her old retail job. Neither of them can earn a dime now, and the medical bills started stacking up fast. I was 25 when it all hit, fresh out of college with a decent job in IT, and suddenly I'm the guy footing the bill for everything. Rent, groceries, doctor visits, prescriptions, you name it, it's coming out of my paycheck. I didn't mind at first. They're my parents, and I figured it's what you do when family's in trouble. My brother, Jake, is a different story. He's 28 now, 3 years older than me, and he's never had his act together. Dropped out of community college, bounces between part-time gigs, and spends most of his time gaming or crashing at friends' places. He's never chipped in a cent for Mom and Dad. Not once. When I brought it up to him a couple years ago, how I'm drowning in their expenses while he's just coasting, he lost it. Yelled about how I think I'm better than him, how I don't get how hard his life is. I didn't push it after that, but it stuck with me. He's always been the loud one, the one who argues his way out of responsibility, and I've always been the quiet one who just deals with it. The first year was rough. I'd work 50-hour weeks, then spend my nights sorting out their insurance claims or driving them to appointments. My savings took a hit, but I kept it going. Mom would thank me sometimes, in that tired way she has, and Dad would nod like he appreciated it. Jake, though? He'd just show up at the house, eat whatever I'd bought for them, and leave. I'd see him arguing with them sometimes, little blow-ups about nothing, like whose turn it was to take out the trash, but he never stayed long enough to help. I told myself it didn't matter. I was doing this for Mom and Dad, not him. Still, it gnawed at me, watching him skate by while I carried the weight. Things started to shift after a couple of years. Mom and Dad's health got better, not perfect, but manageable. Dad's blood sugar stabilized with the meds I was paying for, and Mom got some physical therapy that helped her move around more. The doctor visits tapered off, and the bills weren't as brutal anymore. I started thinking maybe they could ease back into some kind of work. Nothing heavy, just part-time stuff to take some pressure off me. I was still working long hours, and my bank account was barely staying afloat. I'd given up on saving for a house or even taking a vacation. Every dollar went to them, and I was tired. I brought it up one night at their place. I just dropped off groceries, $1.50 worth of stuff I couldn't afford to eat myself, and I said it plain, they're doing better now, so maybe they could pick up a few hours somewhere. Mom's face crumpled like I'd slapped her. She said she couldn't believe I'd suggest that I was trying to abandon them after everything they'd been through. Dad just sat there, staring at the TV, but I could tell he agreed with her. They acted like I was cutting them off completely, not just asking them to pitch in. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent years keeping them alive, and now I was the bad guy for wanting a break. After that I backed off. I kept paying for everything, rent, utilities, meds, because I couldn't stomach the guilt trip. But Jake was still a problem. He'd show up more often now, eating their food, sleeping on their couch, and I'd see the credit card statements with random charges I knew weren't theirs. I told them I wasn't covering his crap anymore. No more bailing him out of his messes, no more cash for his takeout. They didn't like that. Jake flipped out when they told him, and he started fighting with them too. Loud arguments I'd hear about later, him yelling that they were choosing me over him. I didn't care. I was done with him. A few months after I cut Jake off, something bigger started brewing. Mom and Dad owned this house, nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom place they bought back in the 90s. It's paid off, worth maybe $250,000 now with the way the market's gone. I never thought much about it growing up, but I'd been pouring money into keeping them there. Property taxes, repairs, all of it. I figured it was their house, sure, but I was the one making it possible for them to stay. Jake never cared about it. He trashed the place when he crashed there, leaving dishes in the sink or cigarette burns on the porch. I'd fix it all when I could, because I didn't want them living in a dump. Then I found out what they were planning. I stopped by one weekend to drop off some cash for a plumbing fix, $400 I didn't have, and Dad let it slip. He said they were sorting things out with the house, making sure it was taken care of. I asked what he meant, and he got quiet. Mom jumped in, saying they were just updating their will, no big deal. I didn't buy it. Something felt off. Later that week, I checked the county records online, Public stuff anyone can see. And there it was. They'd signed the deed over to Jake. Not a will, not a future plan, they'd already done it. The house I'd been keeping afloat was his now, legal and binding. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I'd spent years paying their way, keeping that roof over their heads, while Jake did nothing but mooch and fight with them. I looked back at the numbers, thousands of dollars in taxes, hundreds on repairs, all the little things I'd covered. It wasn't just money, it was my life, my time, my sanity. And they handed it all to him. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut, wondering how they could do this. I couldn't let it go. The next day, I drove over to their place. My hands were shaking the whole way, not from nerves but from anger. I'd spent years propping them up, and they'd stabbed me in the back. I walked in, dropped the grocery bags on the counter, another $100 I couldn't spare, and told them we needed to talk. They were on the couch, TV blaring some game show, and I just laid it out. I said I'd seen the deed transfer, that I knew they'd given the house to Jake. I asked why. I told them everything I'd done, every bill I'd paid, every appointment I'd driven them to, every time I'd skipped my own life to keep theirs going. Mom started crying right away. She said I didn't understand, that Jake needed the house more because he didn't have anything else. Dad chimed in, saying they didn't want him out on the street, that he'd always struggled more than me. I pointed out that I'd been the one struggling, working myself to death while Jake sat around. They didn't have an answer for that. Mom said it wasn't about who deserved it, it was about families sticking together. I asked how giving him the house while I got nothing was sticking together. Dad muttered something about me being fine on my own, that I had a good job and didn't need help. Their reasons didn't make sense. They talked in circles. Jake's the oldest, Jake's had a hard life, Jake needs a safety net. I told them I'd paid for that safety net, not him. They just kept repeating themselves like they'd rehearsed it. I realized then they weren't going to admit they'd screwed me over. They'd made up their minds, and I was the idiot who didn't see it coming. I stood there, looking at them, and felt like I didn't even know who they were anymore. I left their house that night with my head spinning. I drove home, my cramped one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and sat on the couch, staring at the wall. I kept replaying their excuses, trying to find some logic in it, but there wasn't any. They'd chosen Jake, the guy who never lifted a finger for them, over me, the one who'd kept them going. I pulled up my bank statements on my phone, scrolling through years of transfers, rent payments, medical copays, grocery runs. It added up to tens of thousands, maybe more. I'd never tallied it before, and now that I did, it hit me harder. All that money gone, and the house I'd preserved was his. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how they'd acted, like I was selfish for even questioning it. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went back over there. I wasn't yelling this time, just calm. I told them I was done. I said if Jake's the one they want to take care of them, he can start paying their bills. I told them to let him earn that house, since they thought he deserved it so much. Mom started sobbing again, saying I was abandoning them, that they'd never survive without me. Dad just shook his head, like I was being dramatic. I didn't argue. I'd said what I needed to. I walked out, got in my car, and drove off. That was it. No big scene, no screaming match, just me leaving. I didn't feel relieved or free or anything like that. I felt empty. They'd depended on me for years, and now they'd have to figure it out with Jake. I didn't know if he'd step up or if they'd crash and burn, but I knew I couldn't keep carrying them anymore. The first few days after I walked out were quiet. I didn't hear from Mom or Dad, which wasn't a surprise, they weren't the type to reach out first. I went to work, came home, cooked my own meals for once instead of worrying about theirs. My bank account didn't take a hit that week. No last-minute calls for cash, no Venmo requests for some random bill. It was weird, having money left over. I'd gotten so used to funneling everything to them that I didn't know what to do with it. I just let it sit there, like I was waiting for the next crisis to drain it. About a week later, I got a text from Mom. Short and simple. We need help with the electric bill. No mention of Jake, no apology, just the same old expectation. I didn't respond. A day after that, Dad called. He left a voicemail saying the power might get shut off if I didn't send something soon. I listened to it twice, then deleted it. I wasn't going back. They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. I figured Jake would have to deal with it now, maybe sell something, get a job, whatever. I wasn't his keeper anymore, and I wasn't theirs either. I started hearing bits and pieces from other relatives after that. My cousin texted me, asking what was going on. Apparently Mom had complained to her sister that I'd cut them off out of nowhere. Aunt Linda said Jake was living in the house full-time now, and it was already a mess. Bills were piling up, and he wasn't paying them. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. I'd spent years tangled up in their problems, and I was finally untangling myself. It felt cold, but it was the only way I could keep going. A month passed, and I started getting used to the silence. No more frantic calls, no more guilt trips popping up on my phone. I blocked Mom and Dad's numbers after the third voicemail. Dad's voice, gruff and accusing, saying I was leaving them to rot. I didn't need that noise. Work became my focus. I picked up extra hours, started saving again. My apartment felt less like a pit stop and more like a place I could actually live in. I bought a new chair for the living room, $80, nothing fancy, but it was mine. First thing I'd bought for myself in years that wasn't a necessity. I heard more from the family grapevine though. My uncle ran into Jake at a gas station, said he looked rough, unshaven, twitchy, like he hadn't slept. Apparently, the house was falling apart already. Utilities got cut off for a few days before he scraped together enough to turn them back on. Mom and Dad were still there, leaning on him now, but he wasn't handling it. My cousin said they'd asked her for money too, but she told them no. She knew I'd been the one holding it all together. I didn't feel smug about it. I just felt tired, like I'd dodged a train that was still wrecking everything behind me. I started thinking about what I'd do next. I'd always wanted to move somewhere new, maybe a bigger city with better job prospects. I had the cash now, no more bleeding it out to them. I wasn't sure yet, but the idea stuck. For the first time, I could plan something that wasn't about fixing their mess. It was strange, having that kind of space in my head again, but I didn't hate it. 3 months in, things got uglier. My sister-in-law, Jake's ex from years back, messaged me on Facebook. She'd heard from her brother, who still talked to Jake sometimes, that the house was a disaster. Jake had trashed it, holes in the walls, garbage everywhere, utilities off half the time. Mom and Dad were still living there, but it was bad. She said they tried selling some stuff to keep up, old furniture, Dad's tools, but Jake took the cash and spent it on who knows what. They were behind on property taxes now, and the county was threatening to step in. She asked if I'd talk to them, try to sort it out. I told her no. I said I'd given them everything I had for years, and they'd picked Jake over me. They could figure it out with him now. She didn't push, just said she got it but felt bad for them. I did too in a way. They were old, sick, stuck with a son who couldn't handle responsibility. But I'd warned them. I told them to let him earn it, and they didn't listen. Now they were paying for it, and so was he. I checked the county records again out of curiosity. The house was still in Jake's name, but there was a lien on it, unpaid taxes piling up. I didn't know if they'd lose it or if he'd pull some miracle out of nowhere, but I wasn't holding my breath. I stopped asking family for updates after that. It wasn't my problem anymore. I'd spent too long trying to save them from themselves, and I wasn't going back to that hole.